Nobody ever voted for inflation. There was no referendum, no emergency broadcast, no moment where governments stood before the public and said, from this point on, money will slowly lose its value forever. And yet, that is exactly what happened, not because of chaos or ignorance, but because of a deliberate decision made quietly behind closed doors long before prices ever began to rise. This story isn't about rising grocery bills or supply chains. It's about the moment the world chose a system where inflation was no longer a failure, but a feature. For most of human history, inflation was a warning sign. When prices rose too quickly, it meant something was broken. A war, a shortage, a government mistake. Stable money was the goal. Price stability was proof that a system was working. But today, inflation isn't treated like a problem to eliminate. It's treated like something to manage. Central banks openly target it. Governments plan around it. Entire financial systems assume it will never go away. That shift didn't happen by accident. It happened because, at a critical moment in modern history, leaders were forced to choose between two outcomes: let the system collapse openly, or preserve the system by quietly changing the meaning of money itself. They chose the second. And once that choice was made, inflation stopped being temporary. It became permanent. To understand how radical this was, you need to understand what came before it. In the early and mid-20th century, money was still anchored to something real. Gold, reserves, physical constraints. This didn't make the system perfect, but it imposed discipline. Governments couldn't just create unlimited money. Banks couldn't expand credit endlessly without hitting a wall. When inflation did appear, it was painful, but also short-lived because the system forced corrections. If a government overspent, its gold reserves would drain. If credit expanded too far, confidence would break. Limits existed, and limits are dangerous to systems built on endless growth. By the mid-20th century, Western economies had changed fundamentally. Governments were larger, social programs were permanent, military spending was continuous, debt was no longer an emergency tool, it was structural. Economic growth became a requirement, not a bonus. The problem was simple, but politically impossible to say out loud. A system that requires constant growth cannot survive with hard limits. Gold imposed limits, balanced budgets imposed limits, stable money imposed limits, and limits meant eventual collapse. So leaders faced a dilemma. Do we preserve the rules of money, or do we preserve the system built on breaking them? This wasn't debated publicly. It was resolved quietly. As global trade expanded and financial markets grew more complex, the old system began to crack. Countries needed flexibility. Banks needed liquidity. Governments needed room to borrow without triggering immediate crises. Hard money made that impossible. Every expansion created pressure, and every crisis forced painful corrections. And those corrections, rising unemployment, bank failures, spending cuts, were politically unacceptable. Each crisis taught policymakers the same lesson. Letting the system correct itself was too dangerous, so the goal shifted from preventing inflation to preventing collapse. That shift changed everything. Stability used to mean stable prices. Now it meant stable institutions. Banks had to survive. Markets had to function. Governments had to roll over their debt. Preserving those things required higher prices over time, then so be it. Inflation was reframed, not as theft, but as lubrication. A small, steady rise in prices was no longer a failure. It was described as healthy. Predictable inflation made debt easier to manage. It reduced the real burden of obligations and allowed governments to promise more than they could pay. Most importantly, it delayed the reckoning. There were other options. Governments could have reduced spending. They could have allowed major banks to fail. They could have forced massive debt restructuring, but each option carried immediate, visible pain. Inflation offered something different, pain that was spread out, hard to trace, and could be blamed on everything except the decision itself. Higher prices could be explained away by supply issues, greedy corporations, or external shocks. Inflation didn't look like a policy choice, it looked like reality, and that made it politically perfect. Once inflation became acceptable, the system adapted around it. Long-term contracts assumed rising prices. Wages were negotiated with inflation expectations built in. Pensions, bonds, mortgages, all were structured around the idea that money tomorrow would be worth less than money today. At that point, reversing course became nearly impossible. Stopping inflation entirely would have caused debt deflation, mass bankruptcies, and a financial system collapse. So the choice hardened. Inflation wasn't just tolerated, it was required. Many people still believe inflation is something that can simply be turned off. Raise rates, slow growth, restore stability. But the system built after that original decision doesn't work without inflation. Too much debt depends on it. Too many promises assume it. Too many institutions require it to survive. Removing inflation now wouldn't restore the past. It would expose how fragile the present really is. Perhaps the most important change wasn't economic, but psychological. People stopped expecting money to hold value. Saving became defensive, not productive. Assets replaced cash as stores of wealth. Inflation reshaped our behavior. And once behavior changes, systems don't easily go back. The deeper reason inflation became permanent is simple. Modern debt levels are mathematically incompatible with stable money. Governments don't plan to pay their debt back. They plan to roll it forward. New debt replaces old debt. Inflation makes this possible. Without it, debt would have to be reduced through default, austerity, or collapse, all politically impossible options. Inflation is the only mechanism that dissolves debt without admitting failure. This also reshaped incentives. Holding cash became a losing strategy, so capital moved into housing, stocks, anything perceived as inflation resistant. This wasn't irrational, it was adaptation. The system rewarded those who escaped cash and punished those who didn't. Over time, asset inflation replaced wage growth. The economy looked strong on paper, while real purchasing power for many stagnated. This divergence wasn't accidental. It was a direct consequence of the inflation decision, and that cost is not equal. Asset owners and debtors benefit, institutions adjust, but savers lose. Wage earners lag behind. Those without assets fall further behind. Because inflation spreads its pain over time, resistance is fragmented. No single group feels enough of a shock to force a change. That's why it persists. It's socially survivable even when it's economically destructive. Every time inflation rises, we hear the same promise. This will be temporary. And sometimes it is for a little while. But the structure that requires inflation never changes. The debt remains. The spending remains. The expectations remain. So inflation recedes, then returns. Not because policymakers fail to control it, but because controlling it permanently would break the very system they're trying to protect. Inflation isn't a bug that keeps reappearing. It's the operating condition. Central banks once existed to defend the value of money. Today, they defend the stability of the system. Those two goals are no longer the same. Protecting money requires limits. Protecting the system requires flexibility. Inflation offers that flexibility. From the outside, it appears policymakers are in control. They move rates, release statements, update models. But real control disappeared the moment inflation became permanent. At that point, policymakers stopped steering and started balancing. They don't decide outcomes, they just manage trade-offs. This decision to normalize inflation isn't taught openly because it undermines trust. If people understood that inflation is structural, not accidental, behavior would change, political pressure would rise, and confidence would weaken. So inflation is framed as episodic, a temporary challenge, an external shock, never as a design choice. But permanent inflation changes how we relate to time. Future promises feel unreliable. Long-term planning becomes fragile. Security feels temporary. This erodes trust, not just in money, but in institutions. And when trust erodes, systems become brittle. The decision that locked the world into permanent inflation wasn't made just once. It is reaffirmed every time a correction is delayed, every time debt is rolled over, every time inflation is tolerated in the name of stability. The choice is renewed, quietly. Inflation didn't win because it was good, it won because it was survivable. It allowed systems to continue without confronting their limits. But survival is not the same as health. And history shows that systems built on avoidance don't fail suddenly. They fail when reality finally demands payment. If you want to understand financial history as a record of decisions, not headlines, subscribe to Wheelixon. Because the most important economic choices are never announced. They're normalized.